It's an online subculture defined by anger and loneliness, translated into hatred for women. Jake Davison described himself as an incel, what appears to be a growing community of men who identify as involuntary celibate or unable to form intimate relationships with women.
You know, the reality is that, you know, love is for the young. You know, love is for the young. That's the fact of the matter. Love is for the young.
His videos have since been taken off message boards and forums, but you can see him clearly interacting with incel groups, describing his deteriorating mental health, posting this clip that he felt represented their plight.
Shunned, oppressed, and conquered by those we sought to escape.
And submerging himself into violent video games and gun culture.
Is this the latest face of evil in America?
This is not the first time that the incel movement, which started in the United States, has been linked to mass killings. Just 22 days ago, Davison was discussing US shooting sprees, claiming the UK had more guns than people think.
The incel ideology is really dangerous. It is a shared hatred of women that brings men together online, mainly, but very often takes them offline into abuse, harassment, and violence. This isn't the first incident there where the incel ideology has cropped up. And so I think it's something that needs to be taken much more seriously by government and social media firms.
Last night, the dark underbelly of a virtual world made real. Today, questions over the ability of online movements to radicalise the angry and vulnerable, and how social media platforms should intervene.
Well, earlier I spoke to the writer Laura Bates, who spent 2 years researching online misogynistic groups, and I began by asking her to explain the term incel.
An incel is somebody who describes themselves as involuntarily celibate. In other words, somebody who isn't having sex but wants to be. They're a member of an extremely violently misogynistic online community, which is a sort of sprawling web of forums, websites, members groups, and essentially they advocate sexual violence and massacring women.
We tend to think of them as something to do with the US, associated with the far right. Is that how it works here in Britain, and how big a community are they?
Well, I'd say this is very much a transnational community. They are very much active in the UK. They are also active in the US. And yes, there are enormous overlaps between this particular ideology and white supremacy and other racist ideologies. In the UK, I'd say we're talking about perhaps 10,000 people who are specifically members of or actively involved in these forums. In the US, and more broadly, perhaps in the hundreds of thousands.
And you're in no doubt about the fact that some of these people can be very, very dangerous.
Absolutely. We know this explicitly. We know that again and again, men very specifically acting in the name explicitly of incel ideology and describing themselves as incels have gone offline and committed mass attacks, mass murders. Specifically, incels speak about wanting to murder and inflict pain on women as punishment for the fact that they aren't having sex.
And it is that hatred of women that is so dangerous.
I think partly it's the hatred of women that's very dangerous, and partly the fact that it isn't taken seriously. Even when men like Alec Manassian, men like Elliot Rodger, when men who have committed mass atrocities have explicitly described themselves as incels and said that they've done it in the name of this hatred of women, they've been radicalized online into a form of extremism. We don't tend to describe them as terrorists or their acts as terrorism, and that makes it difficult to tackle them. It makes it difficult to stop this radicalization from appealing to teenage boys who are very vulnerable to grooming by these extremists, because we don't label it in an accurate way.
So for example, in a case like this, when the police moved very, very quickly to say this case is not to do with terrorism, is it your view that actually if killings are motivated by a fundamental hatred of women, that it should be regarded as some form of terrorism?
If that is the case, then yes, I think it should be as it rightly would be if killings were motivated by extremist hatred of another demographic group. I recognise that details are still coming in about this case, but the move so quickly to completely rule out a link to terrorism is extremely disheartening, because it suggests that we just don't take extremist misogyny and violence against women seriously on the same level that we do other threats and other forms of extremism.
And what would need to change for us to do that?
Well, simply, I think we need at a political level and within the criminal justice system, at a policing level, to recognise and take seriously the fact that there are groups of men out there, there are communities out there explicitly devoted to violent hatred of, and specifically grooming and radicalising boys into violent hatred of women. We should bring this into line with other forms of hatred and other forms of extremism that fall under the international definition of terrorism, as I would argue this also does.
And just very briefly, I mean, what role, in your view, should the tech companies play in this? Because so much of this is played out online, isn't it?
Absolutely, there is definitely more that tech companies could be doing. I recognise that there are freedom of speech issues that have to be weighed, but I'm not talking about people making some off-colour sexist jokes. I'm saying when somebody is actively using a social media platform or a website to incite hatred and to suggest ways in which people could go offline and massacre women, then they should be treated accordingly. And at the moment, I think social media platforms aren't taking this seriously in the way that they do some other forms of terrorism.
Laura Bates, thanks so much for speaking to us this evening. Thank you.